he was an incredible man who saw, India before independence, and then landed up in the middle of the anti-Vietnam War protests in America.
But at the same time, in sort of communicating with people, he's always looking for common ground in a sense, and whether he's talking with someone like Allen Ginsberg or someone like George Harrison, or with the sort of the hippie disciples that come to him.
Again, during the course of this book, I found these videos where John Lennon and George Harrison are talking. He thought all of these things would make us happy. We have them. We have them more than anybody else we know. And we are still not happy. To such a person, you can totally see how a Srila Prabhupada intervention would work.
Are you a guru movement too? Like these other guru movements? And he said, no, this is not a guru movement. This is a sadhu movement.
Had Srila Prabhupada lived today, you would find him on Instagram and Twitter.
I suppose the first question is a very sort of general one. So which is in some ways the reason for the book. You've written books on Sardar Patel, and you've written a book on Swami Vivekananda. You've written something on Guru Gobind Singh. And why write a book on Prabhupada? What's interesting there? Why the reason for the book in a way?
Thank you. Thank you. First, I must say I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled, but also this is quite intimidating. I'm reminded of my seminar sessions at Oxford where there would always be one speaker who had usually written a book, and then a whole bunch of us sort of gathered around to ask very critical questions of the speaker. So this is really intimidating. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here, absolutely delighted. Also because what a wonderful spring outside our windows. Why did I write the book on Srila Prabhupada after all the other people I've written books on? Well, the reason is not that he was also a Bengali like me, because in India at least many people think, Vivekananda was a Bengali, I am Bengali, Srila Prabhupada. I'm ticking off all the Bengalis one by one. That's not the reason. Actually, the reason is I have been interested for many years now on something called global Hinduism, which is how did Hinduism, in what manner, shape and form did it spread around the world? Who were the dramatis personae, so to speak, who took this process forward? What reception did they receive? How did they respond to that reception? And in what manner and form were they able to continue the process, or their sort of, the stakeholders that came after them were able to continue the process? And who are the new people who are being added every day to this entire process? And in that entire story, after Vivekananda, surely Srila Prabhupada is a seminal figure, for many reasons. One, of course, is his sheer footprint. We cannot ignore the fact that between the age of 70 and roughly 80 in his life, he managed to establish more than 100 temples around the world. So there is a certain scale that he achieved, which I think is worth noting. There's an ambition in that scale that's worth noting. There's also a certain ambition of institution building, should I say, which is also worth noting, that you not only want to have that scale, but you also have to gather the resources, muster all these people, deploy the capital, so to speak, and so on and so forth. And also, I think what is interesting to me, and I was when Dr. Rembert and I were talking earlier today, I was telling him that, it occurred to me when I was writing the book that when Vivekananda began to talk about his, message to the world, so to speak, many of the first people who helped Vivekananda in the West were really the elite of American society, including, of course, the professor who wrote the letter that introduced Vivekananda to the Parliament of Religions in Chicago. Srila Prabhupada, and of course Vivekananda, needless, I don't have to say this, but Vivekananda, of course, was a much younger man. Srila Prabhupada's case was different. Not only was he a much older man, he began really with the hippies of Upper East Side and Upper West Side, in New York, and many of these hippies were, children of the time. They were essentially protesting against the Vietnam War and so on and so forth. Many of them at that time were beginning to experiment with, all kinds of substances, including, as my book points out, Timothy Leary with LSD and so on and so forth at Harvard. So it was a different constituency, so to speak, that Srila Prabhupada was working with. And all of this, I thought would make a really interesting story. And that's what attracted me to try and tell the story.
Thank you. In many ways, ISKCON itself has produced a large number of works on Prabhupada, from an attempt to kind of chart his entire life to sort of memoirs of his disciples writing on their reflections of their experiences with him. What you're a historian, so what does a historian bring to this that's new in a way, or how does a historian look at this that's different from the what has been produced so far?
So I read a lot of the books that, of course, ISKCON, and there are many very interesting and very well-produced books that have come out of the ISKCON stable, from the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, and each of them are really, fine works. They tell us a lot about Srila Prabhupada's life. But one of the things that I at least felt when I read many of those books, they were an insider point of view, written for insiders by insiders. Many of them were written by monks of ISKCON, followers of Prabhupada. Many of them knew Prabhupada, or at least knew his immediate disciples, and they had lived and worked in that ISKCON universe, so to speak. Now, and this is interesting not only in Hinduism but in many other faiths, I think, when characters like this are written about, it's often as if they existed in vacuum. They appeared from somewhere, they did something which seems miraculous to us, and they sort of disappeared. But we of course know that that's never the case. They too are products of their time. They respond to pulls and pressures of society in the period that they live. They have difficult times. They respond to those difficult times. All of this is true in their very human lives. But that humanity of their lives is sometimes absent in the books that are written about them, which focus a lot about these almost miraculous things that they do. And I think my attempt, at least in this book, was to put a context around Prabhupada. I was saying to an audience at the Nehru Center just yesterday that after I wrote the book, a friend of mine from Calcutta called me and said, it's so good to know that AC stands for Abhay Charan. When I was a boy in Calcutta and I saw AC, I used to think it meant air-conditioned, because I thought these new temples were all air-conditioned as opposed to the old temples which didn't have air conditioning. So there is a context. And one of the things that some people who have read the book have pointed out, there's a lot in this book about Abhay Charan Day before he became Srila Prabhupada. Right? So that part of his life we talk about in quite a lot of detail. And I think in many of the books about Srila Prabhupada, we are focusing, or the author is focusing a lot about Srila Prabhupada, and rightfully so. But some of the context of Abhay Charan Day, I found in the research through this book that the broader family that Srila Prabhupada was part of, they were one of the, at that time, very wealthy families of Calcutta. And one of the things, one distant member of the family did was, and there's a whole history of idiosyncratic wealthy Bengalis doing funny things like this. He actually got a couple of zebras, and he would take his carriage around the streets of Calcutta pulled by two zebras. And it just gives you a sense and color and mood of the universe that the boy Prabhupada grew up in. He saw he saw the plague, for instance, in Calcutta. Right. He went to the same university and college where Subhash Chandra Bose was his contemporary. He saw Gandhi asking people to give up all their, whatever British stuff that they had and burn them in bonfires. He was so moved by Gandhi that he didn't take the certificate from Scottish Church. And anybody who knows Calcutta knows it's a very big deal to not take your, graduation certificate from Scottish Church. Even Swami Vivekananda did not do something like that, So it's a very big deal. So he was obviously moved by the independence movement of India. And after that, he saw the bombing of Calcutta by the Japanese. So, there's a lot of context to his life which made him the person that he became, which I think had to be perhaps brought together in some senses. At least that was my attempt.
Yeah, I think in many ways, as you mentioned earlier, that the most significant achievement he attained was in the final decade of his life. And so I even within sort of, ISKCON, that tends to be the focus of his life. And I think, in your book, it's kind of nice that you spend a lot of time showing the sort of the life before that, showing, what built a man who did then what he did in his 80s. But just one comment on the AC. In a way, it's always struck me that that's quite remarkable that he becomes a sannyasi and he takes the name Bhaktivedanta Swami, but he preserves the AC in his initials before his name, which is quite remarkable. And sometimes it's sort of taken that the AC stands for Abhay Charan Aravinda, which was the name he received at initiation from his guru, that he's sort of honoring his guru in that way. But actually, that's not what he did. He retains his birth name, and when he signs himself in his early documents, he signs Abhay Charan Bhaktivedanta Swami, which is kind of remarkable that here's a sannyasi, someone who's renounced the world. You normally give up your name, but he decided to keep the initials. And so I've always sort of thought of that as there's a way in which he's kind of sort of pointing to that earlier life and sort of saying, this sort of shaped me, this is sort of something that's significant, and sort of carried it on here. And I was particularly glad to sort of see in the book sort of the and what you mentioned earlier, the emphasis, or one of the emphasis being on Gandhi and the impact Gandhi had on him. And I think that's also something, he broke with Gandhi, and he often spoke critically of Gandhi later in life. But as you mentioned, he was a committed follower. He renounced his degree from Scottish Churches College. And there's many sort of threads in his thinking that you can sort of trace directly to Gandhi himself, as he himself admitted. So that's that was quite. I'm glad you sort of put sort of a little spotlight on that. I don't know if you want to respond to that or whether.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. And, what has happened, especially in our very polemical times, is, Srila Prabhupada wrote, 80 books in his lifetime and, translated voluminously. Like Gandhi, you can find any quote that justifies your Twitter argument that day, and you can take out that one sentence and say, well, look, here is the evidence. And that really distorts our opinion, and that really destroys our ability to understand complex lives which are long and have varied experiences. And we tend to see this, have developed this monochromatic vision almost, I think one of the ways to break that is to, enrich the anecdote pool, so to speak, which is probably a writer's task. That, you have to pack in enough so that people get a sense of the complexity that a long and especially as successful a life as Srila Prabhupada led, it wasn't always successful. It wasn't always easy. It was often hard. It was often humiliating. It was often tough. All of this, and it was a long life over a very historic period. I mean, I often think, when I was writing the book, I used to think he was an incredible man who saw, India before independence and then landed up in the middle of the anti-Vietnam War protests in America. What an incredible journey. And then we do disservice to such lives by picking up only chunks, say, he said this about this person, therefore it means this, right? The truth is obviously far more complex. And therefore I think, he was definitely, as we were discussing earlier, really moved by the nationalist movement, freedom movement of India. And who would not be? And that's the first thing he asks his guru, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who tells him that, this is Krishna consciousness and so on and so forth. And his first thing is, well, who's going to listen to all this when we have independence to win? And who could blame him, right? I mean, here was this nationalist movement and, Gandhi asking for, the final struggle against imperialism and all of that. And here was, this man, this sadhu saying, no, that's all very good, but actually this is the real path. And who could blame him for asking that question? And, this commitment towards nationalism and India's freedom movement is something even I had not heard much in context of Prabhupada at all until I began reading this book. That he really, showed a lot of commitment in many ways towards this movement. And we don't think of him, we think of so many people and really minor figures as heroes of India's independence movement. We never think of Srila Prabhupada not accepting, which would be a really difficult thing to get, a graduation degree from Scottish Church. We never think of that as this mark of, of fighting imperialism and so on and so forth. So these are things I think were really important to bring alive his story.
Sorry, I just lost my train of thought with the last comment you made. And I think one of the things that I like sort of coming out of the book, and as we were talking about earlier, is what you highlight is sort of Prabhupada's ability to find common ground with others. That in the encounter with his guru, with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, there's sort of a challenge there. Bhaktisiddhanta kind of shatters his sort of preconceptions in a way, and that sort of is the beginning of his break with the nationalist movement. But what we see kind of in his life later on is this constant sort of attempt to. He sort of receives the teachings of his guru and the message of his guru that he wants to carry to the West and then later back to India. That he's firmly sort of convinced in that and the truth of that, but at the same time in sort of communicating with people, he's always looking for common ground in a sense, and whether he's talking with someone like Allen Ginsberg or someone like George Harrison or with the sort of the hippie disciples that come to him, and sort of not necessarily in the sense of let's agree, but I'm teaching this here, you are sort of coming at from this perspective. Here we have something in common that we can then use to kind of talk about our different points of view in a sense. And I think that came out quite beautifully in your book. So
Yeah, in the book I also mentioned one part where actually somebody notes this, that whenever Srila Prabhupada is asked something which he doesn't agree with and doesn't really want to answer, and the person presses him and he doesn't want to be rude and get into an argument, he sort of gently always says, that's all right, just chant the name of Hare Krishna and it'll be fine, let's just agree on that bit, and that's an interesting, I was telling a television interviewer in India, I wish Indian television did that these days, Indian news television hasn't learned anything from Srila Prabhupada. But I think, that's absolutely important. One of the most fun moments, should I say, of writing this book was discovering a YouTube video. And, we had all, my earlier degrees were in journalism, and we had all heard about these great televised debates between William Buckley Jr. and Allen Ginsberg, the heart of the anti-Vietnam War protests. But I didn't know, and which I only discovered through the writing of this book, that in one of those debates, there's this fierce argument. And after some time, an exasperated Allen Ginsberg tells William Buckley Jr., you're just not getting it. And he pulls out this little harmonium, this mini harmonium from under his chair. And he begins to sing the Mahamantra. And the camera pans to William Buckley Jr.'s face. And he's looking as if, he's just, seen elves or goblins or something. He has no idea. And Allen Ginsberg, it's funny to me, man who wrote Howl and, those great protest poems, actually stops singing for a moment and tells him, you have no clue what I'm doing, do you? And he says, no. And then he says, if only you would understand the value of this mantra, you would see how this war is totally wrong. And I had no idea that this had even happened until I saw this video. And it seemed incredible to me that in the middle of this, this great protest movement, this actually happened on American television. But yes, like you say, when the Krishna consciousness movement came to England, Srila Prabhupada had spent many years in India trying to break through, is the language we would use today, break through and get, again, to use the language of today, get influencers to understand what he was trying to say. He writes to Gandhi, he writes to Nehru, he writes to all these people, he goes to all these people. But in India, he's never able to quite break through. He's always relegated at the margins. He just is not able to build a movement. But what it taught, in my humble opinion, what it taught him was the value of reaching out to people whose voices would be heard. And therefore, when the Krishna consciousness movement comes to England, it is not surprising that one of the people they reach out to are the Beatles. Because who are the greatest influences of all time, and certainly of that time? It's the Beatles. And then when, that relationship builds, again, not surprising that the Mahamantra is developed into a record. I was doing this show in India, and I was telling them, had Srila Prabhupada lived today, you would find him on Instagram and Twitter. Because here is a man who obviously wanted to use whatever technology was available to him to get across the message. But I want to caveat that by saying one thing. To me, one of the interesting things about this story is sometimes this using of technology and trying to get influencers mean people really dilute their message and the message itself becomes something else. In Srila Prabhupada's case, at least according to me, even when he's teaching the hippies that, this is my message and this is why Krishna's love will change you, he's not saying that, okay, you don't have to do any of the things I'm saying, you just sort of, join me. He's still saying you have to wash your hand and you have to, light that agarbatti, that incense stick. And you have to, if you cannot practice celibacy, at least you have to try and be faithful to one partner. And you must leave drugs and you must leave all kinds of intoxication. But in doing so, he's also publishing pamphlets saying that the high of Krishna is greater than any high you could ever get. All of this then obviously makes him a far more interesting, person. So he doesn't dilute his message, but he's always trying to find common ground. And where he can't find common ground, he just basically tells them, sing the Mahamantra, and it's going to be fine.
One of your earlier books was on Swami Vivekananda, and now you've written this book on Prabhupada, as you mentioned, two great Bengalis. But if you and they're often kind of mentioned together as two sort of Bengalis who went to the West and preached there in various ways. But if you think of the two sort of what similarities and what differences do you find between the two?
Well, one very simple difference, of course, is Vivekananda was the disciple, whereas Srila Prabhupada was the guru. In a sense, Vivekananda was very cognizant of carrying Sri Ramakrishna's message to the West, so to speak, right? Whereas in the sense of Srila Prabhupada was carrying, if at all, Sri Chaitanya's message, right? And I sometimes I went to the Radha Govinda temple in Soho yesterday, and I saw, the ISKCON people dancing, singing and dancing. And it occurred to me that during the plague in Calcutta, there are reports in the Bengali newspapers that Gaudiya Vaishnavite groups would sing and dance like this to tell people that the plague had ended on the streets of Calcutta. And when I saw this was so vivid in my mind yesterday, when I saw that group dancing outside the restaurant yesterday and outside the temple, it occurred to me that this is exactly how the streets of Calcutta, and there are reports, I mentioned them in my book, that there are Bengali newspapers who've reported this, saying, on such and such date, after the plague, these groups of Vaishnavites came singing and dancing through the main streets of Calcutta. So there was a tradition. There was a tradition that he was following. The other big difference, one, of course, I mentioned that Srila Prabhupada, of course, his initial disciples were not the elite of that society. The other great difference is that Vivekananda began some efforts of starting an institution. Of course, in America, he created the Vedanta centers and so on and so forth. But it was nowhere close to as grand or as big as the Krishna consciousness movement was. Srila Prabhupada obviously had a far greater success in creating a much greater movement. But that could also, of course, has to be cognizant that, after all, Vivekananda was still a citizen of colonially ruled India, whereas Prabhupada, of course, wasn't, right? But the other big difference, which I think has been noted by scholars also, Vivekananda's message and Sri Ramakrishna's message, of course, there are, obviously great similarities, but there are also differences in that message. There are, Vivekananda finally moved to a very sort of stern Vedantic point of view, whereas Sri Ramakrishna's message had many other sort of softer elements of bhakti and which many people at the Ramakrishna Mission also note this, that in the West, Vivekananda doesn't talk much about Dakshineshwar or the worship of Kali and so on and so forth, that Sri Ramakrishna was so attached to. Of course, when he went back to India, of course he immediately went back to those practices. Whereas as far as Srila Prabhupada is concerned, it's an unbroken message of the Gaudiya Vaishnavite tradition, right? He's very cognizant that whatever he's teaching is what Sri Chaitanya taught. Even the singing, dancing and praying is a message that flows straight from Sri Chaitanya, right? Whereas I think Vivekananda was also certainly a Renaissance figure in India. There were many other elements attached to Vivekananda. Vivekananda had famous quarrels with the Theosophist, for instance, in India, and all those elements were there. But as far as Srila Prabhupada was concerned, the message was really unbroken. It was all his ideas, all the preaching that he was doing, all the concepts that he was presenting, he was very cognizant that these were the core foundational principles of the Gaudiya Vaishnavite tradition that went back to Sri Chaitanya. And he was trying to, and that's why, even in his videos and his writings, he says, it's the Bhagavad Gita as it is. Many people have given commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, many people have said many things, but my job is to present it as it is, without anybody else's filter on it, right? So I think these are quite clear and distinct differences, and both people, of course, had great impact and so on and so forth. But Vivekananda was very much a part of the Bengal Renaissance and all the elements of Bengal Renaissance, especially in the West. Whereas Srila Prabhupada was very cognizant that he was trying to present all the messages, not just the Bhagavad Gita, as it is.
for a long time, sort of ISKCON was particularly seen as sort of a Western movement, that Prabhupada went to the West, as you describe in the book and as you mentioned earlier, he tried to start various things in India at a younger age, and they all either had very limited success or failed in some ways, and then finally when he goes to the West, in his 70s, then he sort of reaches an audience that he hadn't expected there, and then the movement sort of is not just established in the West but also led by his Western disciples. He goes back to India then, and with his Western disciples. But even when he's in India, the movement is in some ways, in some circles at least, still sort of seen as very much a Western movement. And there's the accusations popularized by certain movies that these are CIA agents who've come and sort of spy here, and nowadays, of course, and that sort of continues for a long time, and I think for sort of most of the academic scholarship that exists on sort of ISKCON and Prabhupada to this day has been sort of the focus in sort of the 80s and perhaps sort of in the 90s and the developments in the West and so on. But nowadays, perhaps sort of the balance has shifted back to India, and ISKCON is enormously huge in India, of course, and even in the West, a lot of the temples are predominantly sort of attended. Services are attended by sort of the Indian diaspora. To what extent do you think that sort of changed the perception of Prabhupada himself, and does that sort of has that had an effect or highlights that something of Prabhupada that might not have been highlighted before, if that question makes sense?
And actually, that flows beautifully from what you asked me earlier, because I was just thinking about it. That's also actually a difference between Vivekananda and Prabhupada, because you see, the Ramakrishna mission, even though Vivekananda did start chapters in America and so on and so forth, really from the very beginning was a very India-led, India-driven movement. There's never been any doubt that its heart is at Belur Mutt, which is the mutt that Vivekananda established, right? And anything that flows from Belur Mutt, so to speak. So there is that ownership and that rootedness in Bengal and in India, and everything else happens around that. Whereas, as you correctly say, when Srila Prabhupada died, his core disciples were foreigners, and therefore they led this, this great sort of swath of Krishna consciousness institutions around the world, from Australia to England and so on and so forth. Therefore, this idea that the heart of the Krishna consciousness movement was in the West. It was not so much in India. And that persisted for a long time. I write in my book that even in his lifetime, there was this famous court case in America, where there were these accusations of brainwashing and so on and so forth, right? And I actually discovered another very interesting video from Australia, in fact, between the mother and a daughter. And, the mother is saying that, well, the daughter was raised in, classic sort of Christian upbringing, but now is attending. And you can see that she's like, well, I don't know, she's attending all these people and they have shaved heads and they're singing and dancing and God knows what she's doing there. Whereas the daughter looks completely beatific and blissful, and she's like, no, I'm really happy with these people. They are just, they are the servants of God, so I'm happy with them. But you can see how this would have created, this kind of stuff would have created, bad blood in many families and in many circumstances. And therefore, this famous case that I mention in the book also. But you're absolutely right that all of that has changed a lot. And that has changed because of 2 or 3 reasons. The most important of that is India's own rise. In India, in my own lifetime, and I say this from my personal experience, in my parents' generation, and actually, when I started writing about Hinduism, my friends of my parents actually came and told me this. In my parents' generation, many people who could afford English language education and so on and so forth, wanted to keep their children away from Indian culture. They didn't want Indian superstition, or what they thought would be considered superstition, and things like that to impact their growth. They wanted them to go to the West and make a life in the West, including my own father. I often, and His Grace is sitting here, I often tell people that no matter what I did in my life, nothing was complete until I came to Oxford for my father. And now that I went to Oxford, no matter what I do in my life, it doesn't really matter, because I've fulfilled that one goal that he always had for me, that I should come to Oxford. But that was the way they thought, right? And therefore, a lot of people were cut away from trying to understand religion and traditions and so on and so forth. But I think after 25, 30 years of liberalization, India is at a different stage in that Maslow's hierarchy, triangle, right? I think we have fulfilled a lot of the basic stuff. And there is really a push in India now for among many people. And this shouldn't be confused with, and I'm always very skeptical in saying this, because this then gets dragged into politics and, other things. But I'm not talking about any political party or politics or any leader at all. I'm only saying that in India, many people feel an urge to try and understand, where do I come from? Where do I belong? What are my roots? What does all of this really mean? And they often turn to Western sources for that, because, a lot of the great scholarship has been done in the West. In India, even if it has been done a long time ago. It's not accessible. The language is not accessible. So a lot of people are actually turning to Western writers who have done great scholarship in the work, right? But that demand is certainly there, and that demand exists from very young people. Like most of my readers, I find, are between the ages of 25 to 50. And actually, most of them would probably be between the ages of 25 and 40. Most of my readers, especially in India, are all in that. And even among NRIs, wherever I do tours, in America, in England, a lot of young people. So that demand exists. And what has happened because of that is, when ISKCON has grown in India, it has grown on the back of that liberalization. All these people who finally made money, and wanted to go back to their roots, supported the movement in India. And that, over 20, 30 years has come to a point where if you ask people, Indians in India today, about ISKCON, they would not think, or they wouldn't even remember, many of them, that, a lot of this work was done in the West. They think of it as an Indian thing. I actually did this as a little sort of, test by asking people, where do you think ISKCON's headquarters are? And in India, everybody thinks all of it is in India largely. There might be some chapters around the world, but mostly it's all in India. Many of them don't realize, especially the younger ones, that it has such a wide network around the world. So there's an ownership. That ownership, a lot of people feel that, this is ours. This is, of course, Gauriya Vaishnavite tradition. We're talking about Sri Krishna. All of this is us, right? This perhaps was not true even 20, 30 years ago. This sense of ownership, especially among the young. And I think that has certainly changed quite a bit in India. And therefore, what you refer to, the sense of people, sort of the wheel turning and the ownership coming back to sort of, Indian roots. I think these are some of the reasons why this has happened.
And do you think that because of that sort of in India, Prabhupada is viewed very differently than he might be sort of, say, here in Oxford or in other places, in the light of that?
Certainly, I don't think a lot of people in India know about the CIA, for instance, or about this case. And a lot of people would not. They would think, in fact, many people in India would think of it as a continuation of the Chaitanya tradition, quite simply. A lot of these things you only find out when you go and read and so on and so forth, right? Many people would not associate or understand these things. But the interesting thing here is that you will see a lot of people who are very young wanting some sort of spiritual anchor in India, right? And there are obviously, many streams and thought processes and so on and so forth. But one young ISKCON monk told me recently, I asked him, and he's very young, he must be in his 20s, late 20s. I asked him, so how did you, and he comes from a technical background, I think he was training to be an engineer or something like that. So I asked him, so how did you become part of the movement? He said, I used to really love dancing. So I used to go dancing all the time. So then one day I went to a temple, then I saw all these monks were dancing, they were dancing for a long time. I was like, wow, this is really cool, monks are dancing all the time. So then I always used to think I'll have to go to some temple, then somebody will give me long lecture, this, that. And then after dancing, they gave me great food. So I said, this is wonderful, I want to be part of this. And he was also laughing, and very young, much younger than me. He said, that was the beginning of my journey. I realized that here was the place where people of my age, or many of them, they were young, they were singing, they were dancing, the food was great. I was like, okay, let me begin. And of course, I began that journey and finally decided to become a monk and so on and so forth. So this process is a very interesting process.
Yeah, well, one of the other things that you sort of allude to in the book is something that always struck me as being quite, in some ways, significant about Prabhupada. There's a, at the time that Prabhupada was in the West, there was all these other sort of guru movements that emerged, and there was all these other gurus, and Prabhupada was once asked that, he said, so are you a guru movement too? Like these other guru movements, and he said, no, this is not a guru movement, this is a sadhu movement. And in some ways I think that kind of reflects quite well what he sort of attempted to do, where yes, he was the guru, as you mentioned, but he also had these disciples that he sort of gave a lot of responsibility to, and that he sort of wanted to do things that he could not do, and being one person, being an elderly person, and so on. And I think in many ways, kind of the success of ISKCON in its early years, especially, was the ability, or the Prabhupada sort of empowering these people in a sense, and kind of saying, you do great things. And one of the interesting things that sort of struck me is Prabhupada's insistence from very early on in saying that that it's not a big deal to be a guru, in a sense. He sort of often downplayed his role, and he said the guru just repeats what has been given to him by his guru. And so there is this constant emphasis on, you be gurus too. Everyone should be a guru. Everyone should sort of carry this message and sort of spread this message to the world. And I thought that's kind of there's a few places in the book where you sort of highlight this, that it wasn't just sort of him working alone in a way, but it was him working with his disciples, and him giving that sort of power to his disciples to do these things, that sending them to London, for example, on their own, and getting something started there, or even when he's back in India, giving sort of a great responsibility to his disciples there to start temples and to reach out to people in India. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I have two brief thoughts. One is a funny thought, and the other is slightly more serious. I always think, about this book and Prabhupada's life. It's quite funny what all Prabhupada had to do to get his disciples to understand what he was talking about. To begin with, he had to teach them to wash their hands before eating. That was the first thing in New York. He had to teach them to, bathe every day. He had to teach them not to have drugs. He had to teach them to be, if you were, with a partner, be loyal to that partner, and, Then, when the institutions were being built around the world, his letters are incredible. Not only does each letter mention often how much money, and sometimes it's very small, $10 and $7 and $3 that they have received that day. Later on, when the organization grows, he's basically telling his disciples via letters, I know that real estate guy is a crook. He will take money from you guys. Don't give him any more money. Last time also I told you all not to give him money. But you all gave him some money. Don't give him a single penny more. And imagine there was no telephones at that time. And, telex was very expensive. And it was all letters. So at every level, this empowering that you mentioned, this empowering had to be done at a day-to-day basis, letter by letter. Later on, as he grew older and the movement became very big, obviously there were quarrels between his disciples. So Prabhupada in his letters, has to solve those quarrels, saying, I know this person said this, but then you said this, then they said this. However, at the end of the day, all of you are servants of Krishna. You must learn to live together. It's almost like he's grooming these men and women. He's teaching them how to become human beings and good human beings. He's teaching them to become, men and women of character and quality. Because unless they become that, they will never truly become the devotees that he wants them to become. And the other most serious thing about this is, again, even today, India has many gurus, right? But what is not understood is that in traditional Hinduism, succession via disciples is a very big deal. We call it parampara, right? And that parampara is very important. It has a beginning and it has an end. The message is passed from, guru to disciple in a particular way, in an unadulterated form, so that it's not contaminated. And that's no laughing matter. That's taken very, very seriously. Today with at the time that you spoke of, and even today with the profusion of, spiritual advice and gurus and so, people have forgotten these things. But in traditional Hinduism, this is very, very serious stuff. Parampara is very important. You have to know where your message comes from. You have to know why why are you believing this message? Is it just because anybody said anything? Why would you believe it? How do you know that it's not contaminated? How do you know that the person who's giving this message himself or herself is not contaminated? Or they don't have an ulterior motive. So this parampara framework, so to speak, is a very important framework. And Srila Prabhupada always maintained that, again, this Bhagavad Gita as it is, right? That he's merely a servant. Whatever his guru had taught him, he was passing on. And that had to be passed on again and again and again. So, our earlier question that you mentioned, a lot of people in India finally getting back that sense of ownership, it's again because this parampara idea is coming back again. That there is a tradition, there is a parampara, there is a framework. And that framework exists and has existed for a very long time because of a particular sanctity. So, therefore, he was able to empower while guiding them line by line because of the faith in this framework.
Yeah, and related to that, I mean, one of the remarkable sort of aspects of his teachings is, as you said, he sort of wants to present it sort of as it is, as he's received it. But the remarkable thing is that he's doing that without, in a way, leaving something out. He's teaching people who have no kind of context of India and Indian culture in general. He's teaching them very sort of the things that I suppose someone like Vivekananda would try to avoid in sort of introducing. He's teaching them how to worship images and to worship murtis and to consecrate them and so on. He's teaching them sort of all these practices that you see sort of a lot of gurus who bring things to the West are sort of uncomfortable with, and that people in India at the time too, in certain sections of society, was sort of uncomfortable with, which is quite sort of striking, not just in the sort of the audacity in a sense of doing that, but also in the fact that it was received well by his audience, in a sense, that they kind of went like, okay, this is how we do it, and this is how he teaches it, so this is how we do it.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question, and it's important to try and think, why did he succeed? It's a good question, right? Why on earth would a 70-year-old man go to New York, tell these people, this is a vigraha, you need to worship it, you put an incense stick, this, that, and the other. Why on earth would these people listen to him, right? And I think that already these people, many of his disciples, were rebels of a kind, right? They were rejecting what we today would call the military-industrial complex, right? They were rejecting that framework. And he made an intervention, as we would say, right? He made an intervention in that debate, in that conversation, by saying, yes, you can choose to reject this military-industrial complex that you see is killing so many people and is exploitative and so on and so forth. And you can choose to reject it by saying, I will, not do anything, I'll take LSD, I'll go away, whatever. Or there is a better path. And that better path is for you to be a devotee, to cleanse your life, to find a more centered self. And that centered self comes when you devote yourself to God. Now, of course, since many of these people came from a Christian tradition, or at least saw Christianity around them, devoting oneself to a God would be an idea that many of them would be familiar with. Only his intervention was that, this is a better path, this is a better way. And, in many cases, he's not quarreling with people who are saying, no, but, I believe in Jesus. He's saying, and there's this wonderful part where I write in the book, somebody is very, agitatedly arguing with him, that why are you saying Krishna? Why not Jesus? I think this is... And he asks a very pertinent question, that you're saying, okay, Jesus, how many times do you actually even worship Jesus? Instead of arguing with me that no, it has to be Jesus instead of Krishna, if you actually worship Jesus during that time, that you're wasted arguing with me, it would have done you more good. And that there's a logic, there's an innate logic to that, right? So I think that intervention, telling people that this is a better path at a time when all these people were looking for a better path. They were rejecting a certain kind of, worldview and life, I think is an important intervention. I think part of his success comes from the fact that he made a valuable intervention at a time when many people, especially in America, were seeking such an intervention. Even for the Beatles, before they met Srila Prabhupada, they had already met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and so on and so forth, right? Again, during the course of this book, I found these videos where John Lennon and George Harrison are talking. And, George Harrison is saying that we never thought ever in our entire life that we would get what we have got. It's almost unbelievable. We have more money than we can ever spend. We have more fame than we know what to do with. We have, women chasing us all the time. It's incredible. And he says that we thought when we get all these things, we will be happy. But oddly, now that we have got it more than we could have ever dreamt of, we are still not happy. And that's really weird. And he actually saying, he's a young man, he must be in his 20s at that time. He's saying that's really a very difficult thing for us, that we thought all of these things would make us happy. We have them. We have them more than anybody else we know. And we are still not happy. So we realize now, and he says, I realize now, that something about this is really not making me happy. To such a person, you can totally see how a Srila Prabhupada intervention would work. That there is a different path that you could choose, a path which is more reflective, a path which is more devotional, where you can keep all the whatever wealth you have, but you can dedicate that wealth to a higher cause. And, of course, George Harrison, as all of us know, remained a devotee all his life. But I think this intervention, a different kind of rebellion, so to speak, is an important intervention. And that's perhaps one of the reasons of his success.
So, should we take questions or? Okay. So if I don't know if anyone wants to.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your speech, and I think I found it very interesting that as a historian you had that sort of a temperament when approaching the book. My question is that when we come to the 21st century and I'm exposed to a group of people, even in Oxford, people who don't find, our cultural beliefs as interesting as we would. So my question is, what sort of intervention would you recommend today for people who are not at all exposed to that sort of thought process?
Tell them to sing Hare Krishna.
So, but what is the
No, no,
first step?
I'm
Yeah.
obviously partly joking.
Yeah.
No, look, I mean, what you're explaining is a problem, many other Oxford students from India have faced before, and not just in Oxford, around the world, including in India, right? There will never be a situation, at least according to me, where a majority of people will appreciate your viewpoint.
Right.
Even in your own family, perhaps that's not true, right? In many of our own families, it's not true. I feel that instead of wasting time trying to convince everybody, perhaps it's better to spend that time to try and understand what you really think. And this is certainly a advice Srila Prabhupada would have given, right? Yeah. Perhaps. That, you have a path. You're after all an individual. You have some sort of seeking, whatever it is that you're seeking, right? That seeking can be met, hopefully, if you are diligent about that seeking. Perhaps that time is spent more, and there'll always be people who'll say, oh, what are you doing? This is rubbish, whatever. But that is, one sort of, perhaps that's not the best use of your time to try and address each of those, comments.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for this wonderful discussion. I had one question about the book writing itself. Like, how did you go about? In the beginning, you mentioned that the other books that are out there, they were written from the insider's perspective for the insiders. So, how did you go about researching when you were writing this book, and how did you work on eliminating that bias that it might have?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, again, there's a fun story to share about this. See, one of the ways, at least I do this, is to read a lot of what I would call allied material, right? To triangulate things in a sense. So I'll give you a fun example of this. When I began to write about Srila Prabhupada in New York, I saw a lovely photograph of Srila Prabhupada, this elderly 80-year-old man, and it's a very cold evening in New York. And he's wearing some coat, and he's wearing his dhoti, kurta, and he's got something, some cap or something on his head. And he's walking. He's all alone on this New York street. And there are all these sort of, dust particles or wrappers or whatever flowing behind him in the air. And that occurred to me when I saw that image. I used to live in New York, I used to study there. It occurred to me that, of course, in the time of Prabhupada, even today New York is quite dirty, but in the time of Prabhupada, it was really dirty. It was a very dirty, filthy city, right? So when he would have lived there, and he was a very man obsessed with cleanliness, and it would have been a really filthy city. So I began to read what were people saying about New York in those years. So I saw, for instance, people had written that, in Upper East Side and Upper West Side, homes were full of cockroaches, Then I saw that people had written about dog poop on the streets. Lo behold, it turned out when I began to read the primary material about Srila Prabhupada, even he had observed that the streets are really dirty and there's dog poop in it. Right? So it gives you a context of the man. That's when, see, and now you'll ask me, why is this relevant? So you found out this, so what? What does this even mean? What it means is, then when I read his writings and letters where he's setting up his first little temple, which is a converted store, there he's, really finicky that it has to be absolutely clean. When you approach the altar, it has to be clean. People cannot come without washing their hands. And, the aarti has to be done in a particular way. A certain hygiene has to be maintained. You can see how all the dots connect, right? And I think that probably is an approach. Like I told you that story about the zebra. I was reading about, when I read about which family he was from, I went back and started to read about that family's history in, old Bengali magazines and in other places. And tried to find out, what were these guys doing? They were so wealthy, what were they doing in Bengal? Did they do anything else? What business were they in? And I found out this interesting factoid, right? Again, I was reading about, those years in Bengal. I realized that those were the plague years. And it turned out that there were Vaishnavite groups, singing and dancing after the plague. So you try to find context, right, in this manner to the time in which the person lived. Now from a lady, please. Yeah, there's a lady there. Please, ma'am.
In a nutshell, what's the message you want to give through this book?
The only message every author ever wants to give: please buy and read my book. That's the only message. No, I'm just joking. No, well, I mean, look, I am very interested in the spread of Hinduism, and I think it's a subject that is of great interest or should be of great interest to many people. The only message that I would like to give, apart from the fact that it's a very interesting subject and it might appeal to a lot of people, is that Srila Prabhupada was not, in my opinion, or to me, not merely a spiritual figure. He was also a historical figure. He had a particular contribution in modern Indian history. And I think we do him only part justice if we only look at him as a spiritual figure. And my message, if there is any, is that we should see him beyond Srila Prabhupada, the Guru, as a historical figure who had a historical message or historical idea, and he tried to develop institutions that have far outlived him, and he had a particular contribution to Indian history.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sir.
Many of us feel that around the world, religion has been heavily politicized, and perhaps you'll agree that India is not an exception to this. What would he have made of the politicization of religion and Hinduism in particular?
No, I think we have clear evidence of that already from many of his letters. Srila Prabhupada, I think, at least from the letters I have read, wanted to engage with political leaders, indeed wrote to many of them, but he wanted to engage them in spirituality. He did not want to make interventions in politics per se. He had an opinion, like when he's asked about India's future, he offers an opinion in many cases. But his primary goal always remains to, narrow it down and root it into his spiritual practice, his spiritual journey. What would Srila Prabhupada have made of today's situation? Well, that's always very hard for any writer or historian to say, because after all, our job is to look at the past and not the future. But I think let me say it like this, I think any true spiritual seeker cannot agree with spiritual strife or strife in the name of God. I don't think that's possible. I think most genuine spiritual seekers, genuine ones, do not wish to see strife in the name of religion. I think that if there is ever to be a filter in the 21st century for us to understand who is a real seeker and who isn't, that filter must be they do not seek strife in the name of religion. So, yeah.
You should forgive me because I am asking this question out of ignorance. I mean, I have been to ISKCON places here in India, especially to enjoy the food. But my question is, you talked about the Western education, which we all were brought up in India, and I think a lot of it was influenced by the Christian missionaries who came to India and set up all the schools and colleges, the Jesuits, for example. And they really made a big difference to education. In that same vein, to what extent have movements like ISKCON or other, I'm aware of Ramakrishna Mission, but that's more in the past, but current institutions like these have been change agents in India in terms of either education or social reform? There's so much of deprivation. Or to what extent have they addressed issues of inequality or caste?
No, look, I mean, there's obviously a lot of work that's happening. I mean, for instance, the Akshay Patra movement, as you may know, has delivered 3 billion meals, is about to deliver 4 billion meals. I don't know whether do you live in the do you live in the UK?
Yes, but I'm aware of Akshay Patra.
Akshay Patra has delivered, do you know that it has delivered 1 million meals in the UK?
Yes.
So there's obviously a lot happening. And do you know the same organization or the same sort of parental organization of Akshay Patra? There are branches that also run schools in places like Bangalore, right, to give people a grounded education and so on and so forth. And of course, various other organizations are doing various other things. You mentioned the Ramakrishna Mission. There are others, right? India is a very large country, and any intervention that is done in India seems to be too little, right? But it is certainly true. I would never deny that there are problems, but it is certainly true that there are many organizations who are really trying to do, make a difference. And many religious organizations, many spiritual organizations, which are doing, various kinds of activities to solve issues like inequality, hunger, education that you mentioned, and so on and so forth. Look, I'm a product of Christian education too. In Calcutta, where I grew up, there were only 2 or 3 schools worth going to. And all of them were run either by Jesuits or by Protestants, right? And, I went to one of them. And I actually credit my school very much for having taught me a lot. Now, today people say there are all kinds of other problems and so on and so forth. But be that as it may, I cannot deny that my school had a great contribution in my learning in my early years, right? But there are a lot of organizations, Hindu organizations today, who are also trying to do the same and are working in many different areas. If you want, I can connect you to some of them too. Thank you. All right. On that note, I want to really thank Dr. Rembert. Thank you very much. I really, really appreciate you taking off so much time. Thank you for reading the book, and thank you very much for being in conversation with me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a brilliant discussion and a really nice question and answer session. We have been privileged to witness such an engaging and enriching conversation amongst the dignitaries on the dais on the effect that Srila Prabhupada has had, especially in bringing Lord Krishna closer to us. We thank Dr. Rembert thoughtfully contributing to today's discussion and for providing deeper context to the life and times of Srila Prabhupada. Thank you, Dr. Hindol Sengupta, for touching upon so many inspiring aspects about Srila Prabhupada's life, teachings, and message. Before we move on, I'll also like to thank Dr. Jonathan Katz for being here today. Thank you so much. And other than that, obviously, thank you so much to all you guests who have gathered today to reflect on the life of Srila Prabhupada. Thank you to HumSoc team members and to Lady Margaret Hall staff who have supported us a lot through the evening. And to you. Yeah, I am HumSoc team member, so I did thank myself. Thank you. So also, if you wish to if you wish to buy a copy, we have set up a table outside, and we'll be serving the dinner soon. Before we head outside, I'll just like to inform everyone about what HumSoc is. HumSoc is the Oxford University's Hindu Society. We are basically a home away for Hindu students, home away from home, and we organize religious, cultural, social, educational events for everyone, not just Hindu students, students from all different backgrounds and faiths, and from students from the city and the university as well. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram as well. We are very active. Our Instagram handle is NHSF Oxford Hindu Society, and we are hoping to see you at our events more. Moreover, thank you so much for ISKCON Bangalore and Akshay Patra Foundation India and UK for actually giving us this opportunity to hold this event together. Actually, it's an honor for us that this event has happened in Oxford, and we were the medium through which it could happen. So thank you so much.